Hello, and welcome back to the At Home series. I'm Tess Goodfellow, Secretary of AMFT's Board of Directors. Today, I am thrilled to talk about an exciting new update to a benefit already enjoyed by AMFT members. Our Family Therapy magazine is now digital. FTM is the flagship publication of the AMFT and a leader in research-based, systemically focused content for therapists. The online format has all of the usual features and columns along with many new interactive opportunities, including links to further resources, such as webinars and supplemental reading. Some content will be available to share on social media, and we can't wait to see how you circulate this on your platforms to elevate the unique identity and voice of marriage and family therapists. The new platform is colorful and easy to read on any device so that you always have access to FTM on your tablet, laptop, or phone and can read it on the go. The combination of hard copy and digital really maximizes your reading experience, and I encourage you to open your digital FTM and explore the many options to share and engage within its pages. Explore the new digital magazine today at ftm.aamft.org. For a limited time, access is open and available to anyone to preview this wonderful new site. If you are not a current member of AMFT, visit amft.org/join to retain access to all features and content of the digital Family Therapy magazine. If you are interested in receiving continuing education credits for the session, please consult the reminder email you received this morning to find information on completing your session evaluation and downloading your CE certificate, as well as the check-in code, which will also be posted into the chat. Today's session is being sponsored by CPH and Associates. As the endorsed professional liability insurance provider for AMFT members, CPH and Associates is proud to sponsor the AMFT At Home series. CPH provides portable, occurrence-form coverage that protects you throughout your professional career. During this time of evolving practices, CPH is pleased to assure you that their policy covers telehealth services as long as such services are permitted under your state's law. A policy with CPH provides peace of mind so you can focus on your career. Get policy highlights and an instant quote online at www.cphins.com. And without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce you to today's presenters, DoHee Kim-Appel and Jonathan Appel. Dr. DoHee Kim-Appel is an associate professor in the Master of Arts in Counseling at Heidelberg University in Ohio. She has decades of experience in the field of behavioral health, working with diverse populations of clients across a spectrum of emotional and substance-related issues. Dr. Kim-Appel has presented papers and training sessions regionally, nationally, and internationally, and has co-authored numerous book chapters and papers in peer-reviewed journals. Her research interests include family differentiation, mindfulness, cultural competency, supervision, and international issues in behavioral health. Dr. Jonathan Appel has worked in the field of behavioral health for 3 decades as a counselor, family therapist, clinical supervisor, director of behavioral health services, consultant, researcher, department chair, and educator. He is currently a full professor in the Department of Behavioral and Social Sciences within School of Criminal Justice and Social Sciences at Tiffin University in Ohio. Dr. Appel has presented papers and training sessions regionally, nationally, and internationally, and has co-authored numerous book chapters and papers. He is currently on the editorial board for the International Journal of Mental Health and Addiction. Welcome, Dr. Kim-Appel and Dr. Appel.
Thank you. First of all, thanks to AMFT creating this opportunity, and we are pleased to present this topic. Today, we are hoping that this presentation helps your own research and teaching in the clinical work.
Yeah, one of the things about this theory, taking it from theory research to practice to teaching, I've been interested in it quite a while. It's to me, it's taking the not only family systems theory, which I always call the wide lens view. This is also the wide and long lens views. Given our natural orientation is for multiple generations, intergenerational assessment and practice and research, this theory seems to coalesce and be able to join multiple research streams as well as implications for practice and teaching. So it really represents the confluence really of, even stuff like interpersonal neurobiology, taking a look at not only the family context, but also the social and cultural context. And it's adding the awareness of history. So in recent years, there's been more recognition of this historical trauma has really impacted individuals across time. So hopefully through looking at this, the lens of this theory and some of its research, we can take a look and have new directions, particularly for vulnerable populations. So we're going to be kind of examining some of the research to date and some of the implications of that research. And it fits, to me, square in the lens of this wide lens view of family therapy.
So we just both love this quote by Glenn Elder. I'm just going to read out loud. And lives are lived in specific historical times and places. If historical times and places change, and they change the way people live their lives. So with this, his perspective, and I thought about what is really historical trauma. And historical trauma theory is a relatively new concept in public health. The premises of the theory is that the populations are historically subjected to long-term massive trauma, such as colonialism, slavery, and war, and genocide exhibit a higher prevalence of disease even several generations after the original trauma occurred. The consequences of passing down the effect of trauma are huge. Even if they are subtle, altered between generations, it will change the way how we view our lives in the context of our parents' and ancestors' experiences and influencing our physiology and our mental health. So Jonathan will discuss more in depth about historical trauma theory.
Yeah, one of the things about taking this wide and long lens view is it has us look, not only the effects of to current generations, but really, how much of past generations we inherit, including particular groups. This concept began, discussing the literature in the 1960s, and it was first centered around public health because they were concerned about and noticed through time, groups who were subjugated to things like depressions, famines, Holocaust. They were noticing that this lasting impact was happening for generations. Braveheart and De Bruin first applied this more recently in the 90s to the American Indian population. The original population which this theory got its traction was taking a look at survivors of the Holocaust. Not only the devastation of the trauma of the survivors of the Holocaust, but they were discovering both mental health and physical symptoms were going out for multiple generations. So this was the beginning of the formulation of historical trauma theory. So it was primarily started with Holocaust survivors and then applied to Native American Indians, and more recently, the research is taking a look at other groups, particularly African Americans through time. So it really, represents the lingering and profound consequences of history for major events, where these events not only target individuals, but they seem to be targeting collective groups. And this trauma seems to be held both personally, but also within families and transmitted across these families in time. And then unfortunately, sometimes they're really reinforced by culture. Then some of the systemic inequalities and oppressions that continue through societies, and those also seem to be a contributing factor to kind of hold this trauma in and contribute to the transmission of it across generations.
So, and with that, so where the historical trauma originated, I think that's a really challenging thing to pinpoint to where that was. According to literature of historical trauma, originated and indicated that with subjugation of a dominant group led to overwhelming physical or physiological violence and economic deprivation and cultural disposition. And that it really it can be translated into extreme trauma, and it is often viewed through kind of static snapshots. But as a systems theorist, we can see the replication of a generation as moving image across time. Some may only view trauma as a current snapshot of fairly recent event. However, historical trauma is an unfinished movie, like if you could see. Most of family theorists understand how it transmitted to generation, and the snapshot may appear and disappear. This is kind of a familiar term. We call it first order change. Maybe momentarily, behavioral change can alter the system temporarily. However, without conceptual shift, we call second order change, the vulnerability may still be there for the future generations. And one of my experience, I can share that as an example from the client. That is when they believe treatment is completed and able to maintain stability. Could be emotional stability or individuals struggling with addiction and they're in a recovery, maintaining their sobriety. And they believe the addiction ended at their generation, at least with the clients or client himself or herself. However, according to the historical trauma, and predisposed trauma is there to be triggered, kind of predisposed. But knowing this information, the individuals and family members can prevent the continuation.
Yeah, this is systems theory, both at a family level, but also a collective cultural level, and also represents the impact of the systems within our body. So we're really seeing the impact that is across health. So we're talking about, emotion. We're talking individuals who, even if they, and the research indicates, even if they don't directly experience the trauma, for instance, offspring of Holocaust survivors, they still end up with many of these symptoms of sadness, anger, detachment, anxiety, unresolved grief. They have difficulties in interpersonal relationships. The physical illnesses occur not only as symptoms, but there's indications such illnesses such as hepatitis, smoking is increased greatly. Issues related to certainly substance abuse and dependency. I think the one study said that the risk goes up 12 factors. As well as, again, that clinical depression and even suicidality. So these, contribute to a lot of what clinicians may see as, classic mental disorders according to the DSM system.
So therefore, it is so important for us to use a trauma-informed approach to the family assessment and the treatment. I think assessment is very, very crucial at this point. It will help us to identify, recognize, and unrecognized trauma in the family, and especially historical trauma. And as we all know, I'm assuming, and there is no specific diagnosis of generational trauma according to DSM, that is Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorder, and fifth edition. And that's all licensed professional mental health professionals use, right? But the phenomena of intergenerational trauma is well accepted throughout the literature. And according to English, this author, that indicated that we know trauma can manifest itself through stress, anxiety, fight or flight, just like Jonathan talked about, and other heightened alert systems in our brain and bodies. But intergenerational trauma can also mark itself through learned beliefs and behaviors and patterns that become ingrained in us. So this kind of wiring, we talk a lot about that in a brain wiring, and that can impact in a physiological wiring, and that personalities and relationships and parenting and communication and view of the world. So, so we use those three different terms, but interchangeably, generational transmission, transgenerational, cross-generational, and generational trauma, to emphasize the theory of how trauma can transmit it over generation to generation. Jonathan will discuss the research on genetic code that you may be familiar with.
Yeah, one of the issues, at least I started looking when they were looking at the physical health literature, and this is at the same time the rise of researchers becoming interested in epigenetics. So we have, of course, the psychological transmission of certainly how people think, behave, and feel. But the question was, what may this be doing to our genetic code? And they originally took a look at blood samples from Holocaust survivors, and then they looked at their children, and these were compared to controls who had not suffered the same amount of trauma as the Holocaust, living outside of Germany. And one of the findings that they found, there seems to be these experiences get encoded in our biology, and particularly the impact of this one gene, the FKKB5. And they found this gene is changed by these experiences through something called methylation. And again, methylation is adding menthol to the DNA. So again, this is a modification that affects the way this gene is expressed. And this change is thought to increase the way an individual is susceptible to anxiety and stress.
So this video will sum up what we have been talking about, the genetic marks, and hopefully that this video will teach us and thinking further about how historical trauma impact in generation to generation.
59-year-old Karen Soniber grew up on the North Shore of Long Island, just an hour's drive from New York City. Her parents survived the Holocaust, but rarely mentioned it.
All I knew was that we were different, that I was different. I didn't exactly know why.
Her parents were Jewish, born in Germany, but after Hitler came to power, their families fled. Soniberg's parents were just children, but carried the traumas of Nazi oppression throughout their lives.
My mother, from the time she was 3 on, from my father, from the time he was 5 or 6 years old, he was subjected to the painful existence in Germany.
Despite her own comfortable upbringing here in the U.S., Soniber privately struggled for years with anxiety and stress. And while she couldn't prove it, she believed it was somehow linked to her parents' traumatic childhoods.
Having discussed this with many of my friends who come from similar backgrounds, it seems to be consistent in most of us. There were definitely challenges that, quote unquote, American kids didn't seem to have experienced.
Even though you weren't there.
Exactly. That's the amazing part of it.
Now, a new study published this month in the scientific journal Biological Psychiatry bolsters Soniber's belief that she experienced the after effects of her parents' trauma. Dr. Rachel Yehuda, director of Mount Sinai's Traumatic Stress Studies Division, led the study. Her team interviewed and drew blood from 32 sets of survivors and their children, focusing on a gene called FKBP5.
We already know that this is a gene that contributes to risk for depression and post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yehuda noticed a pattern among the Holocaust survivors called an epigenetic change. Not a change in the gene itself, but rather a change in a chemical marker attached to it.
And when we looked at their own children, their children also had an epigenetic change in the same spot on a stress-related gene.
What does that suggest?
Well, in the first generation, in the Holocaust survivor, it suggests that there has been an adaptation or a response to a horrendous environmental event. And in the second generation, it suggests that there has also been a response of the offspring to this parental trauma.
Which means children of Holocaust survivors like Soniber could be more likely to develop stress or anxiety disorders. Though their study was small, Yehuda and her team controlled for any early trauma the survivors' children may have experienced themselves. How is it that a parent who was subjected to the trauma of the Holocaust is able to somehow transmit that to a child who wasn't there?
Oh, that's a really good question. And this study that we did doesn't address the how. The study that we did just provides a proof of concept that we might be able to identify the how if we do more research.
DNA is passed from parents to children, but research like Yehuda's suggests parental life experiences can modify their body chemistry, and those modifications can be transmitted to children as well. Scientists have examined this idea before. After a famine in Holland during 1944 and 45, children were born with the effects of malnutrition 2 generations after the food shortage ended. Previously, Yehuda herself studied stress hormone levels in children born to women who survived the September 11th terrorist attacks. She's been examining the link between trauma experienced by Holocaust survivors and their children for more than 20 years.
A trauma is an event that changes you, and it doesn't have to change you for the negative. Trauma changes you in lots of different ways, but most people who experience extreme trauma learn a great deal from that experience. And some of those lessons may be lessons that are transmitted to the child, and that's not a bad thing.
Yehuda says the implications aren't limited to Holocaust survivors, but this dwindling population provides insight into how clinicians understand and treat stress disorders.
If you're at risk for heart disease, a lot of times a doctor can separate out, well, this is your weight, that's not good, this is your diet, these are your genetic risks, and things like that. And it would be very nice if we could develop a similar risk profile in the mental health arena, where we would be able to understand where the risk factors come from for depression and anxiety.
We're on the 10th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. There were children who were born after that trauma. There are children born in the trauma of a war in Syria and other crises around the world. If you're the child of a parent who experienced trauma, are you doomed to be depressed or stressed for the rest of your life?
I don't think you're doomed, but I think that many children of traumatized parents have struggled with depression and anxiety. And I can tell you that many of them have felt relieved that there might be a contributing factor that has been based on how they're responding to their parental trauma. I think that it's helped people work through a lot of that depression and anxiety.
Relief is exactly what Karen Soniber, the child of Holocaust survivors, felt after she participated in one of Dr. Yehuda's trauma survivor studies. She lost her mother 30 years ago, but looks forward to her father's 90th birthday next year.
I've learned to cope in my life. I've learned to move on and get over all of this. Had I known at the time how my reactions could impact future children, my children's reactions, I might have dealt with things differently, or gotten them some sort of treatment that maybe would help them in the future.
Yeah, as identified there, you're really seeing that there are these biological changes that cross generations. Certainly, we've been hearing a lot about the gene expression of turning on and off genes through epigenetics. And it's interesting, for generations, children of trauma victims, even without having trauma in their own lives, they seem to bear the marks in their DNA. It is not that fear is being passed down directly. It's that fear in one generation and trauma in one generation leads to a sensitivity and the mechanisms that kind of create a nervous system prone to survival crisis, if you will. It's interesting what the research now is trying to determine how long does this last. They've been finding effects up to even 3 generations. So how long this lasts might depend on some of the modifications, both in families, some of the protective factors, but they also represents an opportunity for therapists and family therapists to be able to intervene to keep this transmission of trauma from maintaining itself across history.
So as you see how important that is to treat individuals from a family system perspective, that helping family members, really we're helping them to discover a covert experience from generation to generation into overt, for them to gain a better understanding of each family member's struggle and their own struggles, as you saw in a video, and early discovery, instead of waiting so many years to finally realize, that was maybe the issue, that really this approach strengthened the key interaction of family interaction processes. And also, Walsh really states very succinctly here that systemic approach to intervention, strengthening key interactional and interpersonal processes, and that foster really healing in not just the individual, but all entire family system and the future generations, and definitely gaining from resilience, and that they can really feeling more grounded, understanding, and they can move forward with their lives without wondering what happened in the past or what needs to be happened, but they have a really much more clear direction for their future life.
One of the things, historical trauma contributes to kind of real-time trauma. As we know, real-time discrimination, racism, oppression, social injustice, economic instability, these all create these mechanisms that, influence our mind and our body, that we experience economic difficulties. So an individual who is born with the results of historical trauma, then if they experience, systemic and or family or outside family trauma, this is only going to amplify and continue the process at extremely high levels.
So now we have a better understanding of all those contributing factors, and probably there are more that we're not recognizing. But when manifest into unhealthy mental health issues, as Jonathan pointed out, and we often talk about this, and I use this in the class too, that using David Olson's SARC complex model, that really, help us to fully conceptualize the family functionality. He focused on the level of flexibility and cohesiveness that has a lot to do with family structure and then interpersonal relationship. As you see in this PowerPoint, definitely contributing factors to that is paranormal psychopathology, family conflict, relationship. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So often, family individuals feel distanced or disconnected from their family of origin, but this is more kind of feeling than fact. As we know, families so profoundly affect their members' and thoughts and feelings and actions. Also, people solicit each other's attention, approval, and support, and they react each other's needs and expectations and upsets. Just think about some of the things that you had experienced with your family of origin or your relatives. This connectedness and a reactivity, it makes the functioning of the family members kind of interdependent. And that's the kind of foundation of what we do in a family therapist. This emotional interdependent and presumably evolved to promote cohesiveness and flexibility and able to take the we and I position exchangeably and with confidence. And the family structure allows family members to be who we are as we as a family, and also I as an individual. And circumflex model really demonstrates high flexibility and a low cohesion, and a high cohesion and lack of the high flexibility I meant. And so family can be chaotically disengaged. There's so much flexibility in the family, no boundaries, no structures, and at the same time, they have a lower level of cohesiveness than individual family members tend to disengage from entire family system. And also, when lack of flexibility and a low cohesion, that's pretty detrimental for the family, right? They're rigid in the family structures, and definitely family members tend to disengage from the family of origin. And when we talk about some enmeshment, chaotically enmeshment, that has a lot to do with high cohesion and high flexibility in the family. They are just emotionally too close, right? There's a role confusion comes in, highly independent, interdependent, and as I talked about, pointed out the lack of boundaries between family members. And also that really does not really allow to individual to be independent. We talk, in the family literature, we talk about family level of differentiation, right? And they are pretty staying in a lower level of differentiation, and they continue up to a high level of differentiation, where individuals and family members, gain level of differentiation, then they tend to maintain healthier well-being, and they can enjoy their lives without pathology that now DSM-5 identifies a diagnostic criteria. And when family members get pretty anxious, and their anxiety escalates by spreading infectionally among family members. And of course, family members tend to grab toward to something to stabilize their level of anxiety, right, or conflict. And that we see as in clinicians, mental health issues and substance use. So Jonathan will continuously talk a little bit about what that does to continue some of the societal issues.
One of the results of trauma. One of the areas I also teach and do research and have a degree in is in criminal behavior. And it's becoming exceedingly clear in the literature that criminal behavior is often, not always, but is often really a symptom of trauma and unresolved trauma. And certainly this is due to maybe issues experienced in the course of the individual's lifetime. There's ample research now as a result of the adversive childhood experience study, which seems to indicate some of the unfortunate negative outcomes. But one of the things you see is this perpetuation of vulnerability to traumatization, and for some individuals, particularly males, a resulting symptom is antisocial or criminal behavior, without being truly an antisocial personality disorder, meaning if they were treated and if the trauma was identified and worked through, the individual would not offend. So rather really than criminalizing, if you will, trauma, can we take a look at opportunities for what I call therapeutic jurisprudence? And this isn't to be confused with the idea of somehow, letting a person off the hook, for any kind of criminal behavior, because as we all know, consequences is part of, dealing with these issues, and it's part of good treatment is having consequences. So it's not really about going soft on crime. It's really about using the combination and of consequences, but also as the research amply supports, taking a look at kind of the criminal justice system as a therapeutic opportunity. And certainly we see this in Ohio, as in many other states, a way to identify and resolve, try to resolve trauma to reduce future criminal behavior is the therapeutic courts. So we see that in the form of veterans courts, who many veterans are suffering from undiagnosed, untreated post-traumatic stress disorder. So using the leverage of the court to be able to get them assessed and treated. So we think, a therapeutic jurisprudence approach to dealing with some of the symptoms, but making sure that we identify and trace this back to any kind of trauma, whether that's real-time trauma in the course of a person's lifetime, or if it's going back through history, and recognizing and identifying those kinds of traumas as well. This isn't really telling anything that we don't know. This is just to kind of reinforce the idea of trauma really is all pervasive. It affects society, it affects the individual, it affects the family, all in really negative kind of ways. But if there's any kind of silver lining when you look at the research, it's the idea this can be interrupted. Certainly many disorders, including trauma, whether the impact is a combination of how many risk factors versus protective factors does an individual or a family have. I'm thinking of the well-known developmental asset models, the 40 developmental asset models. Many of those developmental asset models, which serve as protective mechanisms for substance abuse, mental health issues, are very much relational, and particularly family relational. So that gives us pinpoints very specifically where we want to target our interventions, things like family communication, family boundaries. All of these are considered protective factors in the developmental asset models, as well as the large roles that school systems and the way they treat, since we really need to take a look at the school to prison pipeline research and ask ourselves the question, when do our institutions consciously and unconsciously contribute to the increase of trauma? So we need to identify it at all systems level.
So we've been talking about so many contributing factors and possibly how it transmitted in a historical trauma. And definitely we have to pay attention to parental style and abilities, right? and oftentimes the parents and their own mental health issues that really impact how to parent their children. Not necessarily, oftentimes our students talk about, so whose fault is that? And we need to hold accountability for parents not doing the parenting. But if we understand systemically where they are, and we have a better ways to support the parents, right? Creating support system as well. And also, take a look at attachment style, and that's again, and transmitted through generation to generation. And all these narratives they were told by their ancestors, and that's another thing. And another way of looking at the family transmission of generational trauma is the readiness of the individuals and the family's entire system. And two, take a look at this one. I will talk a little more about that in a later slide.
Okay, some of the intervention approaches that have been identified in the literature in regards to intergenerational trauma and dealing with it. Three models, there's a lot of approaches. Three models jump out right away. Certainly when we're talking about large groups of individuals who experience more of an immediate kind of trauma, it could be a natural disaster such as flood or famine, or it could be, war or genocide. The survivors are often collected together and they do what's called narrative exposure therapy. Have the individuals be able to work through, identify, and recognize and gain new meaning about the traumatic events that have occurred. And that becomes important, the narrative that gets built. We think not only in individual generations, but even the narrative, what is the meaning of what has occurred, across generations. Certainly cognitive behavioral therapy, as in many treatment approaches, also comes up. And again, taking a look at how the person thinks about frames and reframes the narrative around the meaning of the trauma. And there is actually a model that's manualized, and they're currently doing more research on this, is the intergenerational trauma treatment model. And this model is, again, this is, looking at complex trauma, so severe and profound complex trauma in childhood. It's the integration of cognitive behavioral, but it's also taking a look at, through the systemic lens, informed, and I would have to say, not totally, guided by, but informed by psychodynamics, particularly in regards to relationships. And it's about intervening again, there's a structural intervention when you're focusing on the parents and how they've responded to the trauma and how they're going to work with a child who may have been traumatized. So again, this is a manualized treatment that's in the literature, and it's designed for parents of children who've been traumatized between the ages of 3 and 18. But certainly, this approach represents perhaps additional models we can develop once we see the full research around it.
Okay, so we talked about some of the theories and how we can approach the family treatment. There's several, interventions that is a very, very powerful, yet it's difficult to quantify. And before I talk about expressive therapy interventions, that definitely genogram is the champion of learning about the family in a historical trauma. And many of you, I'm pretty sure, are using genogram, and that was one of my favorite intervention assessment tool, and able to help individuals and family members and tell their story. I ask them to bring their pictures, right? Pictures when they're growing up. We tend to talk about the moment where they were, how old they were, and what are the surroundings, situations at the time. And clients tend to tell such a rich story about their lives through that intervention. And also, another thing that I use in stage of change, we use in addiction treatment, pre-contemplation and contemplation. We're trying to use that to motivate our clients to move forward, right? But also I use that to really assess and understand the family. Is the family ready? Are they in a place where they can work with this individual, family members, to maintain their stability as well as family? As we all know, that's very challenging for individuals and they understood what they need to do, yet they have to go back to an environment where their family members or family systems are not quite ready to accept what's going on or what has been going on. So, and that is very important to assess. So speaking of expressive therapy, and I think talk therapy is really, really helpful. However, using expressive therapy interventions been, it's incredible. It is, I think as Atir talked about, trying to open this blocked fountain that we're trying to help them to open that up, to have some, consistency and congruent in the communication. So client can be, cognitively rationalizing, understand, but then our body reacts differently. And a trauma that's embedded physiologically, embedded in our gene or physiological reaction. And that is somewhat incongruent or contradicting how they think and how they feel. So trying to help clients to kind of make the connection, able to identify what they thought, their thoughts and feelings, and whatever that in a situation struggles they had. But emotionally, if that is contradicting, and that's where our intervention can be very empowering. So Jonathan and I talk more often about bottom up and then top down, and so that client can utilize all different creativity. We use a lot of, definitely clay is so important. That clay can really, sensory issues too, because a client with a traumatized in a history of trauma, we have to be very mindful. What are the interventions that we use? What kind of material that we have to use so that that does not contribute to triggering or taking clients to where they were when they're not ready to face it. So it is so important to selecting materials, how to integrating into your family therapy. Of course, when you're not trained to do this, you wanted to take some training, continuing education, and gain their understanding how that really applies to the family treatment. Okay, so we have few minutes left. And as you see, Jonathan and I are partners, and we talk more often. We talk about this one. Some people say, "Oh, you guys are so boring," and how do you do that? But it's fun for us, exploring some ideas and some of the theories that we read, how we teach, and how we practice. So we're going to have this brief conversation that we normally have at home before we end it.
Yeah, one of the things we learn about topics by, we go off and read the literature, and then we do our teaching, and then we're at separate institutions, and then we come back and we have dialogue, and I think we gain new insights, new questions, and implications from our dialogue. We're a couple who has the same degree in couples and family therapy. That we have our specializations, as you might have been able to recognize. She's trained as an art therapist, and where we differ in training, then I'm trained in criminal behavior. So we have our similarities and our differences. But we have a lot of unanswered questions about the implications of historical trauma theory. One of the things that is kind of hanging out in some of the biological research is, they talk about epigenetics, and how long that lasts, again, depends on those risk and protective factors in each subsequent generation. That vulnerability is still there. Yeah, but the question is, if this cycle keeps reemerging of trauma generation after generation, I guess the question is there at a point where epigenetics becomes genetics, becomes fully embedded in the person's genetics, and may make them prone to more severe kinds of mental health disorders. So that's one of the things that's kind of a question mark for me. But certainly we also have question marks about what's the implications for practice.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We talked about, is there a way to develop or think about genograms from this historical trauma framework?
Mm-hmm. Well, as you know, I am Korean American, and I came to America 30 years ago. And so family history has been very, very important. And as I departed, and I collect story as much as I could, and still I do. My parents are 80s. And there's anything nitty-gritty of all the detail of family history, because they went through colonization by Japan and the Korean War, and they left their home at age 18 and around 10-ish. So they went through a lot. And I have a really better understanding of their thoughts and their decision-making process based on what I heard from them. And from time to time, I recognize in me, and I told Jonathan, like, oh my God, I am my mom. And then I tell him he's by marriage, but oh my gosh, you act like my father. So we tend to really have the conversation how our family of origin impacted on our thought process and decision-making process. And it is just fascinating. And our conversation is how this pandemic really impacted on our generation. Can a pandemic create a new generation? And this has been another historical trauma that we wish we did not have, but it happened. So what do we have to do to help this generation to gain resilience, and how to create support system, because so isolated at this point. And our technology is helpful, but because of technology, we tend to be isolated at the same time. So it is a very complex and a conflictual situation, and love technology, but how is it helpful? And a pandemic taught us, and something very valuable that we did not recognize lately, but at the same time, and how it's going to be impact in many generations later.
Yeah, I have particular concerns about healthcare professionals. Not only in the United States, but across the world. Certainly we're witnessing at the time of this recording what's happening in India. And India is totally being devastated and overwhelmed by a new wave of the virus, and their healthcare system is breaking down. And certainly you hear the statistics, but when you hear the personal stories, including from healthcare providers and family members, just how devastating and traumatic for many individuals this pandemic has been. And all indications are, mental health symptoms and diagnosis. They're talking about that's going to be the second pandemic. So you're dealing with trauma in the context of perhaps certain groups, historical trauma. It brings up the question, certainly the literature originally has identified Holocaust survivors, American Indians, African Americans, but certainly we can look across the world. Recently it was finally recognized the genocide of the Armenians by our government, and certainly that's impacted that culture and those individuals and those families for multiple generations, or probably through to the present. Recognizing that, I think, there's always a political layer to everything. Even recognizing that perhaps helps, rebuild a narrative, because it's all about, certainly having meaning for these events. The research indicates not having meaning and not having quality relationships are highly predictive of all sorts of problems, including early mortality. And this study that we've done of historical trauma theory has made me go back and look at interpersonal neurobiology, the research around that. and there's nothing more protective or healing, even at a physical level, is its relationships, as far as protecting us against things like cortisol and adrenaline, replacing it with an increase in serotonin, dopamine, endorphins, it's the biggest biological protector perhaps of them all, is having healthy relationships, and recognizing when they're not healthy and being able to assist people to be healthier.
So I think it came to the end of our presentation, and I hope, and we hope, our presentation kind of reminded you of things that already you're aware of. Or maybe some of you are not quite familiar with what we just talked about this topic, and hope that you will continue to explore and learn and have a conversation with your colleagues and your surroundings. Thank you so very much for participating in this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you both for that insightful discussion. I also want to thank our sponsors of this series, CPH and Associates. And as a reminder, if you are completing the session for CE credit, please follow the instructions in the email you were sent this morning. Our final session in the series features Chloe Madonis, who will share stories of psychotherapy. Don't forget to reserve your seat at amft.org/@home. I hope to see you there.